Okay, so let's get started right away. It is a female entrepreneurship job research seminar series, and the session was recorded. We're streaming from a beautiful Bozeman, Montana, and the goals of those seminars is to see what we know about a topic, what we don't know about a topic, and maybe brainstorm some future research ideas. We always focus on the data and methods, and some seminars more than the other. We already have, maybe I will wait for something if you can hear and see me okay. Give me maybe some thumbs up here if all is good. Okay, awesome. Okay, so we had two seminars that were already been presented. The first was on female entrepreneurship and external financing, and I have a little handout if you want me to send it to you. Put your email in the chat or just email me and I will send it to you. And then next week we talked about Women Don't Ask, and the recording of the seminar is posted on the YouTube channel, our college YouTube channel, and you can see the link from the seminar webpage. I can also send it to you. Today, we're talking networks and female entrepreneurship, and I will address this subject first. And then we have an awesome guest. We have Tracey talking about very exciting topic about the women entrepreneurship in the financial technology industry. So can't wait for that. Okay, so let's talk networks first. Okay, so let's start right away. When we're talking about entrepreneurial networks, we need to mention the utilities they give us. And the first utility is, of course, the advice. And this may be advice on either recognizing the opportunity, maybe changes in law and regulations, new technologies, and access to specialized knowledge. So these are examples of the advice people get from the networks. Resources, of course. And finally, emotional support. So we talk about all those utilities that entrepreneurs can get from the networks. Then when we talk about the networks, we also want to talk about the strength of the network. And of course, it depends on the frequency of interaction, on the nature of the relationship. Is it between friends and family or just or strangers? We talk about the emotional intensity between people in the relationship and the multiplexity of the relationship. It is the friend or the investor. And when we talk about those, we literature calls those strong and weak ties. And what's very, very important to point out is that the literature is clear on that we need both. We need strong ties in our network. We need weak ties in our network. What the literature is not clear about is the optimal combination of the strong ties and the weak ties in our network. So that's definitely still an open area for research. So now, when we talk about strong ties, we usually think an example would be, of course, family and friends. And those strong ties, we say in the literature that they produce bonding social capital. And they can give us, they usually don't really give us a lot of advice, entrepreneurial advice, but it can provide in some way some resources, and they can provide especially emotional support. On the other hand, the weak ties networks, and these can include other entrepreneurs, mentors, investors, and in those networks, when we look at the utilities of those networks, we usually think about bridging capital, bridging social capital, and those could give you advice and they can give you the resources, but not so much the emotional support. Yes, but again, this is not black and white. This is just to look at the strength of the network and the utilities of the networks. Okay, so now why are we talking about women and men networks? Yes, why do we think that there could be any differences there? And yes, there is difference because the literature does show for years now that people tend to associate with others who are like themselves. So and again, this is just in general, even as kids, girls play with the girls, boys play with the boys. So there are those networks forming right from the beginning. So we can talk about the women networks, we can talk the men networks, and we can talk about what are the best networks. We can even talk about this. Because, okay, so let's just talk a little bit about characteristics of those networks and what literature shows and what literature tells us that we still don't know about the networks. What we do know is that female entrepreneurs actually spend considerable amount of time forming those networks. So using their formal and informal networks. But they still have smaller networks. So women entrepreneurs usually were found to have smaller networks. Is that a problem? Well, there is research that shows that the number of network relationships actually has a positive relationship with the access to resources. So yes, it may be a problem for women networks. It was also found in the literature that women have higher proportion of those strong ties in the networks. What some literature calls the women networks are denser. People are closer and know each other well. And on the other hand, men networks were shown to be more diffused, so they were not so closely connected with each other. One paper actually shows that women networks include a high proportion of neighbors and proportion of kin neighbors. Okay, is that a problem? Okay, because we always think, is that a problem? Would that be something that would limit women entrepreneurs' access to all the utilities that networks provide? Well, actually, interestingly, that could be a problem, and it can be actually especially a problem for female networks. Because what we also found that families would support more, and again, in general, some families may support men entrepreneurship more than women entrepreneurship. So they actually can get lower emotional support from those family ties, strong ties. Actually a paper that I published, my paper, I found that female entrepreneurs who self-employed employees, self-employed females, were less likely to be covered by health insurance, by their own health insurance, and not covered by their husband insurance when they relied on friends and family as a source of information. So yes, that could be a problem. Another point that's also in the literature is that high level of strong ties is actually associated with lower levels of trust outside the network. So that's an interesting thing and idea to remember. Women had lower proportion of weak ties in their networks, which will give them less bridging social capital. But it's not the same for all ventures, because actually female entrepreneurs had a higher proportion of bridging social capital in what's called lifestyle ventures. So those ventures that want to maintain the profit they have not interested in growth. On the other hand, male entrepreneurs were found to have a higher degree of bridging capital in the high growth ventures. And that was from the paper from studying entrepreneurs in Florida. And the same paper, actually, looking at a sample of women entrepreneurs in Florida, they found that race matter and experience matter. So there was more bridging social capital for white women and more bridging social capital for more experienced women. Okay, so now let's go to diversity. And in both networks, we see limited diversity. And actually, women networks were found to be more collaborative in inclusive relationship. And these numbers were really a little shocking, that only 10% of men networks were gender diverse, but over 40% of women networks, including both men and women. So interesting statistics. Those men networks are often actually referred to as old boy networks or fraternity contracts. And the problem of this is that women are often excluded from access to those male-dominated high-level networks. That is especially true for outside the US, but it's also it's less silent, but it's also mentioned in the literature using US data. Men networks were, in the sense of the diversity of who they included, they more include people like lawyers, accountants, and other professionals. While women networks did not include those professionals. And this is why we see those barriers to access to the resources. And that's actually very interesting, because in this paper, when they interview 235 women who sought equity investment, what they find, of course, is that venture capital industry is male-dominated and relies on referrals. And that creates a significant barrier for women, because those networks now are less likely to overlap, because there is not enough women in venture capital industry. Female were found to join female-owned business association in our clubs, and the bad side of this is that the less diversity produce redundant advice and limited access to opportunities and information and resources. The best networks are in the literature are those cited in the literatures are those that have close ties with high heterogeneity. That gives the biggest number of resources. Very interesting study that shows that women tend to rely upon a male colleague as their primary contact, but then revert to female links for all subsequent contacts. While that was not the case for men. So interesting study here. For high growth ventures, there is a paper by Romy in 2009 that shows that female entrepreneurs who led high growth ventures, their networks were similar to those of male entrepreneurs. Now, we know from the literature that it's not so easy to say you should have this kind of network or this kind of network. Actually, from all the review of literature for my paper and what I did now before the seminar, it's easy to see that we don't know much, because those favorable effects of social capital vary by gender, by venture type, by race, by ethnicity. So there is no one set of network that fits all. And one paper actually looked at this and said, that there is diminishing marginal returns of networks. So they found in their data, it's a paper from 2014 from ETP, and what they found is that at the beginning, when the networks were small, there was more there was more gains from the network. And then once they've looked at the bigger networks, then those returns diminish. And they actually went back and looked at the papers from the other studies, and they found that that was the case in other studies, that papers that actually looked at ventures with smaller networks found significant results, but then papers that consider ventures with bigger networks found not significant results. Recommendations that you can see very often in the literature for female entrepreneurs is the recommendations to build this bridging social capital. So keep in mind the density, diversity, and appropriate ties when you build the bridging social capital. So for example, join networks like National Venture of Capital Association. Also very often cited recommendation is the female mentorships from high growth to low growth ventures. And of course, the big role of supporting organizations for female entrepreneurship to help build those networks, build this bridging capital for incubators, universities, small business development offices. What's next? Well, my last 2 slides here. I want to stress that the literature is clear, that the literature on networks, depending on the network, on gender, is poorly developed, and we need more literature on the subject. And we don't know how people acquire, build, use, and benefit from the networks. And we don't know how entrepreneurial networks are connected to the processes and outcomes. So big area for research, a lot of open questions for the networks. And I can go ahead and maybe have some time for questions, but then we're gonna go to Tracey and we're gonna go to Fintech Industries. Okay, if we don't have questions, Tracey, you can go ahead. I cannot hear you, Tracey. Tracey, if you can unmute yourself would be great, because I can see that you are muted.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry, my system was freezing up, so give me just a second.
Okay, no worries.
Let me see what's going on. Okay, I'm going to try to share now. Just had to wait for it to want to come back to life during this time of the day. See. All right. Can you guys see the video? See the PowerPoint presentation?
We can see and hear you great. At least I can.
Awesome. Awesome. Let's see. I'll do this. Can you see me as well? Yes. All right.
Right now
so there we go.
cannot see yours. Oh, you can see your slides again.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Agnieszka. Thank you so much for inviting me at Montana State University. I am Tracey Clark Jeffries, serving as a DBA student at the University of Missouri St. Louis, currently working into my dissertation, going into the study of looking at evaluating Black-owned small businesses and trauma-stricken communities. But today, for this Women Research for the Female Entrepreneurship Series, I wanted to present the unprecedented value of women entrepreneurs in the fintech industry. And I thank you guys for allowing me to actually kind of hash this out with you guys because I'm interested in the fintech industry um, and how women maneuver around it. And so I find it fascinating how technology seems to be an ever-changing, evolving industry, but then it kind of laggers behind in regards to how women can maneuver uh, among the industry as entrepreneurs and financing. So this is kind of what this kind of shares. And so I want to start by giving you some heads up on how the presentation is going to go. We're going to talk a little bit about the fintech industry and how it came about. I want to share with you some data and charts that I retrieved from the Center for Financial Inclusion data and the Consulate Group for the Poor that provided some of the statistics on the disparities of women, of the gender gap in the fintech industry. We're going to look at a few, some of the countries and some of the challenges that they have, and then, what we can possibly discover and some suggestions of what could be put in place for to meet the gender gap, looking at it from an investor standpoint, from a researcher standpoint, and just from the fintech companies as a whole. And then finally, we'll look at some opportunities for future research that could be um, something that we could kind of explore or others can explore in the future to meet the needs of the gap in the industry as well. So the fintech industry is fintech innovation actually is a technology concept that was created to merge communities and people who have been excluded from the traditional industry. It was identified as the key driver for the growth of many fintech companies and is used mostly by SMEs to help with capital and business operations. The emergence of the fintech and its services, it changed how the industry looked. It went from providing industry operations to staffing to the financial segment of big data. The services kind of consist of areas in a variety of areas: consumer banking, lending, international money transfer, insurance, personal finance, and equity financing. Today, there are 3,000 fintech companies globally, and the number of female founders in the fintech industry is only 12%. And then from the user perspective, it's only 1%. So in this presentation, we're going to evaluate women entrepreneurs and the gap between being users of the fintech service and also women-led entrepreneurs who actually run fintech companies. And unfortunately, through this, what I found really despairingly was I was not able to find a whole lot of data on women, particularly in the percent of what they're using as a whole, besides the 1%, you know, only women-owned startups receive venture funding. But there's a unbanked population of women. We make up 55% of the unbanked population globally. And there's about 1 billion women who are currently unbanked. So that means that the fintech industry has an opportunity to capitalize on this, but they're not necessarily doing it. And this is a chart that kind of shows the disparity among this. The green indicates the female-led tech companies. As you can see, North America, the US, we are leading, but we're just above the average of 19%. And while the other industries are below, fall below. And then the purple represents the non-female-led tech companies. The next chart shows female-led tech companies that actually provide financing. And as you can see, female-led tech companies provide their financing is actually low as well. So these are the service users here compared to non-service users, compared to male or non-female service users. And you can see that disparity as well. So the challenges we're going to talk about. Let's talk about some of the challenges because these countries, our countries face various challenges for various reasons. So in Africa, they have the highest rate of women in the fintech industry throughout globally, but the women who seek the services are a lower disadvantage than men. Only 7.4% of the fintech founders are women. And the reason for this gap is because laws surrounding inheritance of the land or ownership of land is an inability to finance. So they have some laws that kind of prevents them from getting financing and taking ownership. If they're to inherit land, if they own land, they can't get it, things of that nature. And then, of course, lack of financial literacy and credit rationing. And I want you to pay attention to this red because I'm going to go through 4 states and the data shows in all four countries, and the data shows in all 4 countries that this is one in particular that is our primary reason for having a gender gap in the fintech industry. In the US market, women make up 4.8% of the women-led fintech in the US. And technology-based industry is partially the reason because it is a male-dominated culture, so it makes it difficult for women to enter. Lack of financial literacy, and then underrepresented in leadership roles in the U.S. For challenges in the fintech during the Middle East, 400 fintech companies in the Arab world, there are only 2% that have women that include women in their mission statement. And the lack of financial inclusion in underserved markets is another reason. And of course, their lack of financial literacy and credit rationing. And then women's ownership and access to the use of mobile cell phones is also a hindrance in the Middle Eastern. In the Asian markets, Asia accounts for 60% of financial excluded market. Women are not seen as profitable, so therefore they just don't care to try to market to them. Another problem is that their lack of financial literacy and credit rationing. So all 4 of these countries all have one thing in common, and that's the lack of financial literacy and credit rating. Now, the U.S. market did not have a credit issue, but they had a leadership role issue where women are underrepresented in this industry. So now let's take a look at the discovery of, what we would like to do if we were to research this opportunity, this issue in the fintech industry. What would we want to look at? Because why aren't women participating? Is it something that women are inflicting among themselves? Is it something that the fintech industry is doing themselves? We want to, discover if there's any kind of systematic pushback for women to participate, what limitations women have among themselves to minimize the engagement. We also would like to learn from the women who have entered the industry and have them share their stories. There are tons of articles and research that were out there for the month of March, for Women's Month. And it was about fintech industry and some of those women and how the challenges and they still feel, although they're in the industry, they still feel like they are set aside. And so they are still have their, even though they enter the market, they still have the challenges navigating through the market. And then also determine if there can be some monitoring in the fintech industry regarding the sustainability of women participating in that industry. So behind that, then we want to propose maybe some research questions. What best practices can be adapted in the industry to help more women engage in the fintech community? What barriers or pitfalls women can avoid in order to participate in the fintech industry as service users or entrepreneurs? And one of the recommendations or suggestions after doing the research, I would say diversify accessibility and product design. If they diversify the accessibility in the products, that would create opportunities for fintech companies to assist new users. And that would give them ability to target low-income users and people with disabilities. How would they do that? They will partner with community organizations, provide in-person digital training, and work with community role models. The benefits of a diversified fintech industry: women fintech founders would target female clients and underserved market populations, doing more business in those areas. Also, women who are participants in the fintech industry as service users and founders are found to be more philanthropic to supporting underserved communities. So this would improve the overall economics of the economy as well. Other benefits of the fintech industry: it would also allow women-led fintech companies to actually to improve their performance, by leading, having a profit and meeting performance ranges in those areas as well. Another benefit in the fintech industry is meeting the financial performance of the gender diversity as far as ethnic and gender related and combined would put an overall increase of 75% in that diversity quartile for fintech industries. Closing the gap as researchers. What can we do as researchers? We can research valuable evidence to build a case for investment in female-led tech companies. We can identify the nuances and barriers that female-led tech companies face, and then we can build upon that work. Closing the gap as investors. Investors can address the underrepresentation of women in the fintech leadership by investing in more regions. Address funding disparities by adapting gender lens investing through grant funding, and then design incubators and accelerators to support early stage female-led tech firms, raising funds and making their programs more female-friendly. Future research opportunities for women in fintech and closing the gap. After reading several articles and kind of researching this, these are some of the things that I came up with that I thought would be some good future research opportunities. A deeper dive in the diversity and the fintech industry would be something that could be needed. Best funding practice for women entrepreneurs in the fintech industry. Fostering programs that provide incentives to encourage the fintech industry to close the gender gap. And changing the perspectives of the fintech industry to encourage more women to enter. A case study regarding women's participation overall in the fintech industry as service users, employees, and founders. I found that quite interesting that there are many articles that either target employees or founders. There's very little data for service users, probably because they're really not participating or not getting the approval because of the lack of credit rating, but no one is looking at the overall concept of all of it and combining that. And then partnerships and collaborations of traditional banks and fintech companies working cohesively to close the gender gap among unbanked women. I saw a research article saying, can traditional banks and fintech companies come together and meet the gap and the needs of the economic disadvantage? And so that would be interesting to see as well. And there are some references there for your likings of the readings and some of the research that I gathered from. And I believe this concludes the presentation. Now, are there any questions? Thank you for the hand clap, Maria. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you so much.
How do you do a hand clap?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, how do you do a hand clap?
I want to do that too.
Yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to chime in or put them in the chat or anything.
So, mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hi, Tracey. Thank you so much for your talk. That was really interesting. And Agnieszka, also for the introduction. That was a really nice segue, I guess, building of the topic. And then Tracey, I'm curious if you were to summarize, what do you think, like, the biggest obstacle to women engaging in fintech is? I know that's a huge question, but I'm just thinking you laid out quite a few obstacles. So if there was like a priority to research, what would that be?
The priority would probably be lack of credit, lack of or financial literacy. I noticed through all of the countries, even looking further into like either in Europe as well, everyone had literacy as one of their components. So, but then the question rises, you know, do fintechs take on that? Do they create incubators and programs that provide literacy so these women can actually lead or be service users in that industry successful? How do you get them to um, participate in gaining more financial literacy? And that's another big question.
That is
And it
very,
all depends on the countries as well. The country, there's so many barriers, like I said, in the Middle East, the women aren't even allowed to have phones. So what do you do? You're on mute.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Okay.
To realize that. Yeah, that's a more systemic problem. Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, interesting.
You're welcome. Thank you.
yeah, it is very interesting. Actually, in the recent paper I published, I've seen that what women want from incubators and accelerators, and the research was clear that they want financial knowledge and they want to gain it more than other ventures. What I always wonder if they get it. So I've
Hmm.
seen, the data from Emory University, and I analyzed those, and they have surveys before women enter the accelerator programs, and they do say they want this financial knowledge, but I haven't seen the ending data. There is no surveys at the end if that's what actually happened there, and what happens in the incubators, and what if there is actually inclusion there. That's actually the big question what I see, and I would like to see more research about this too.
I think that may be the answer. If the fintech companies develop more female-based, female-friendly incubators, and then those programs are actually inserted into those accelerators, and that will help those women that come along. It'd be interesting to see the number of women that would participate in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That's great.
yeah. I think that's very good points, both of you guys. Yes.
Yeah. So looking at other countries, do you see? Yeah, I haven't. The data I had was for US, but I don't know how other countries compare to that. Is there a trend of the education? Who does it? Are there programs? Um, do you see anything like this, Tracy?
Well, I recently took a trip to Africa, and I stayed there a few weeks, and I was in Ghana. And Ghana is a big entrepreneurial community. And I mean, they name it, they sell it. And from my evaluation there among individuals, women went out and worked. They were entrepreneurs, they made clothes, things of that nature. They used the apps, as service users for us like translate money, but none of them, really were getting financing of things of that nature. And so that could be a gap in that could be the gap in the gap issue is not able to obtain funding. Uh, and it'd be interesting to know, you're right, Professor Agnieszka, it would be good to know if that's something to research. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be an additional research. Hmm. But I did learn there that a lot of women are not, you know, they don't really either you work because you are extremely poor, but if you are wealthy, the women are not allowed to work.
Mm.
And so if they want a business, they're not allowed to have that. So that means if you're poor, that means you don't meet the credit ratings. So
Yeah. Oh, that's
yeah.
interesting.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. I appreciate this. Thank you. Turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, guys. If there is any questions about networks or more to Tracey, let's be happy to hear. If not, we have the next week actually have Brooks presenting, so we'll see you then, and then the following week we have we have 3 more weeks left of the seminar this semester. So I welcome you and invite you to join us for our future seminars. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
We have a lot of things.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.